The Stolen Lake by Joan Aiken. 4. They boarded the riverboat at a black and silent hour of night, when all the citizens of Tenby were abed and asleep. The night air was sharply cold, and Dido grumbled to Mr. Holystone as the small party walked through the silent streets. "Why in the name of Morpus does we have to start off now?" "It is on account of the boar." "Boar? It's a right plague." "No, child." She could hear the smile in his voice. "A boar is a tidal sweep of water which will, I am informed, carry us upstream as far as Bewdley." They crossed a bridge on the island in the middle of the Severn River and walked to a cobbled quay where a strange-looking craft lay waiting. It had a cow-like rounded bow, 3 open decks, and a huge paddle wheel at the stern. "Mussy," said Dido. "Will that thing take us up the river? It looks like a floating chicken coop." Captain Hughes also eyed the riverboat with some disfavor, but its wooden structure was gray with age and green with waterweed, which seemed to prove that it must have battled its way up and down the Severn River a great many times without mishap. The passengers climbed down a ladder from the jetty and were shown to their quarters. Captain Hughes had a small cabin to himself on the upper foredeck. The others went down to the middle deck, which was open right through the middle of the boat, from stem to stern, with a large dining table at the center and a row of small box-like cabins on either side. The lowest deck was for cargo, and Dido, looking down a flight of wooden steps, observed that it was packed with freight: bales, barrels, tied-up cows, and crates of poultry. The space by the rail was kept clear, and on each side 12 great wooden handles protruded through slots in the deck. "What's those for?" Dido asked Mr. Holystone. "I infer that is how the boat is propelled. Rowers pulling those levers cause the paddle wheel to revolve." Indeed, the passengers being now all embarked and the mooring cast off, 24 Cumbrian oarsmen wearing nothing but black cotton trousers took their places at the levers, and after a shouted command from a coxswain, hauled repeatedly on the handles and let go until, with a mournful creaking and groaning, the boat was set in motion and worked out into midstream. "It's a mite slow, ain't it?" said Dido doubtfully. It was not slow for long. After about 10 minutes, when the dim lights of Tenby had fallen away astern, Dido began to hear, above the creak of the levers and the groan of the paddle wheel, a kind of huge sigh that began far away and came closer and closer, becoming so loud at last that it drowned all other noises. At this moment a vast wave overtook the paddle boat and rolled it along the river as a leaf is bowled along an eddy. As a leaf is bowled along by an eddy. The rowers continued to work at their levers. Dido would have liked to ask why, but could not possibly have made herself heard. But after a while she guessed that the motion of the paddle wheel helped to steer the boat and to keep it on course in the middle of the stream. The members of the Thrush's crew settled themselves in the after part of the boat, stretched out comfortably on canvas cots. Dido found herself a cot and placed it up in the bows, where, when day broke, she would get the best view, and also be as far as possible from Silver Taffy. She found it difficult, however, to get back to sleep. She had slept for a few hours at the White Hart, with Mr. Holystone mounting guard over her slumbers, and now felt fresh, alert, and rested, ready to begin the next day. But the next day was slow in coming. There was no sign of dawn. Up above, huge southern stars blazed in a dark blue sky. On either side, high ramparts of tangly black forest moved endlessly past. Sometimes a pair of eyes could be seen flashing in the darkness. Sometimes a menacingly large winged shape coasted overhead. For a long time these were the only signs of life in the forest of Broceliande. The deafening thunder of the tidal bore gradually decreased until it became a low, rushing gurgle, like the sound of a distant waterfall. After an hour or so, Dido began to catch sounds in the forest: the shrill cries of night birds, the wail of a peafowl, the hiccuping cry of a screech owl, The mewling cry of a great cat, the bellow of an alligator, the barks of apes, the grunting of wild pigs. Sure is a lot going on in those woods, thought Dido. I ain't sorry we're doing this bit by boat. Guess I wouldn't care to live in Bath Regis if the only way to see is through this forest. There's too many critters in there waiting to bite and sting and scrunch. There were humans, too, equally fierce, as she presently discovered. After a while, the moon came climbing up over the forest trees, and then, once or twice by its light, she saw shaggy, wild-looking men who came down to the water's edge with drawn bows and discharged long, jagged arrows after the boat. Fortunately, the arrows in each case fell short, and the bowmen, dancing and gesticulating with rage, were soon left behind. The next thing Dido saw was so strange, terrifying and dreamlike. For a while afterwards, she wondered if perhaps she had dreamed it. The boat had by now arrived in a region where the forest was not so thick. Wide open glades, clearings, and savannas alternated with great spreading creeper-hung trees, whose black shadows were encircled by areas of silver moonlit jungle grass. Sometimes the ship was in shadow, sometimes in moonlight, as it swept upstream, and Dido, yawning on her canvas cot, was beginning to be lulled by the change from light to dark, and from dark to light. She had been on the point of stretching out and falling asleep, when her attention was caught by the sight of mounted horsemen galloping toward the right-hand bank. As they neared the river's edge, it could be seen that the riders were cloaked and hooded, all in black, and that there were hounds galloping silently along with them. The hounds were fairly large, pale-colored, white perhaps, all except for their ears, which seemed to be brown or black. Fancy a hunt, thought Dido drowsily. Rummy time of night to go tally-hoing. Wonder what they're after. There'd be plenty to choose from in that wood. The riverboat, on the crest of the bore, overtook the riders, passed them, and drew ahead, round a bend of the stream. In a few minutes they came within sight of the hunter's quarry. Dido saw with a horrid shock that it was a human being. Whether male or female, she could not be sure. Somebody apparently carrying some heavy object, running and stumbling along the bushes close to the river's edge, blundering with frantic speed of terror through the low-growing scrub, slipping, staggering, recovering, and floundering on again. The riders are going faster than that, Dido realized with horror. Whoever it is ain't a-going to get away, not unless they can swim out to us, and she jumped up and had started up the companionway toward Captain Hughes on the top deck when the leading hounds came up to with their prey. There was a lot of noise from the bank, a shrill triumphant baying, a shriek of despair. Then came a splash, as the fugitive apparently took to the water. A couple more splashes followed. Several of the hounds must have plunged in likewise. But the main pack bounded along the river, yelling, baying, and whining with excitement and frustration. The hunters, now evidently abandoning hope of securing their quarry, called in the hounds with shouts and short, shrill blasts on a horn, then drew away from the water's edge. But meanwhile, all this commotion had alerted the members of the Thrush's crew, and Dido, hesitating on the companionway, heard Lieutenant Windward call, "Hey! The poor devil's in the water! Stand by to throw him a line!" The boat's coxswain evidently objected, for Windward exclaimed, "Stuff and nonsense, man! I saw him myself! It must be done! Throw a line, I say!" Then there were various cries and splashes. Greatly relieved that Lieutenant Windward had the matter in hand, Dido returned to her cot. Half of her wanted to go and see what was happening, but the other half still felt shocked to death by such a sight. Hunting people? Who could do such a thing? She would just as soon not know any more about it. Suddenly she felt very sleepy indeed, and without intending it, she fell into a profound slumber. When she next woke, it was full day. The middle deck of the riverboat remained just as tolerable, since it was in shade, and the air could pass through from prow to stern. But Captain Hughes soon found it necessary to quit his superior quarters on the top deck, which received the full heat of the sun blazing straight overhead. He came down the companionway in a disgruntled frame of mind, and Mr. Holystone placed a cane rocking chair for him on the forward end of the deck, where he sat, occupying himself with designs for flying craft. Several times he threw chilly glances at Dido on her canvas cot nearby, as if intimating that she ought to have the politeness to withdraw and leave him in privacy. But Dido did not choose to take notice of these hints. I got here first, she thought. Let him keep himself busy drawing pictures of skiffs with wings and let me alone. It was Dido who first broke the silence, however. Captain Hughes, she said after a while. Well, his tone was exceedingly rebuffing, but she went on. Did you hear that ruckus in the night? What do you mean? Why, the hunt. There was coves on horses a-chasing some poor so-and-so who jumped in the river. What do you reckon was going on? Who were they? It is no affair of ours, he said sternly. But I thought Lieutenant Windward had someone pulled on board. Didn't they say— Miss Twite, I have said this before, and I will say it again. I must beg that while we are in New Cumbria, you do not meddle in matters that do not concern you. But, hush, child, run along now. I hear Mr. Holystone calling you to breakfast. Out of patience with the captain, Dido unwillingly rose up and took herself off to the long central table where a couple of Cumbrian crewmen were serving breakfast to the passengers. The meal consisted of greasy fried eggs, lukewarm tea, and fried plantain, which, as Mr. Multiple observed, was like warm, oily oak chips. Mr. Holystone, having taken the captain his breakfast on a tray, sat down with the others. He looked unlike himself, Dido noticed, pale, hollow-eyed, and slow in his movements. Probably he saw the hunt too, Dido guessed, and she immediately asked him about it. Who were they, and what happened to the one they were after? Did you save him, Mr. Windward? Both men appeared reluctant to answer, but Silver Taffy had no such scruples, and struck in jeeringly from farther up table. Miss Longnose wants to know, eh? It'd serve your quisitiveness, right? If the same thing was to happen to you? He laughed in a very disagreeable manner. Swimming in the Severn River ain't too healthy for the complexion, as you'll see if you go look in that cabin. He nodded sideways toward one of the little box-like cubicles which nobody had wished to occupy because they were too stuffy. Now, Taffy, broke in Noah Gusset, let the young'un be. You didn't oughtn't to tell her that. No, child, do not look in the cabin, exclaimed Windward and Mr. Holystone in the same moment. But Dido, abandoning her unwanted breakfast, had crossed the deck and looked through the half-open door. At the sight of what lay inside, she gasped, half in fright, half in almost disbelieving astonishment, for the inmate of the cabin, reclining on the canvas cot, was a shining white skeleton, with its grinning face turned to the door, as if expecting someone to bring it breakfast on a tray. Only one hand was still intact, the left, on the third finger of which gleamed a gold ring. Determined not to let Silver Taffy see her shock and distaste, Dido stepped away from the door. She felt rather cold and queasy. The dancing reflections thrown up by the water on the bamboo ceiling swam and jiggled in front of her eyes. Mr. Holystone had moved toward her anxiously. He looked pale and troubled. She asked him in a low voice, Taffy ain't commoning me, is he? How can that there be the one they was after? How can it? I'm afraid Taffy is speaking the truth, Mr. Holystone answered gravely. The small fish that swim in these waters, they are called piscadores, have such a rapacious appetite, that 3 or 4 minutes in the water is enough to reduce any red-blooded creature to what you see there. The hounds that jumped in suffered the same fate. Murder, muttered Dido. She thought of the poor fugitive jumping into the water, knowing full well what would be the result. What had he or she been carrying? What fate could have been worse to make death in the river better than capture? This is a right dreadsome country, she said and shivered. Best not go paddling in the river, Madam Nosy now, shouted Silver Taffy, and stumped away to the stern, spitting over the side. Dido did not trouble Captain Hughes with any further questions. She spent the rest of the day playing cat's cradle with Mr. Holystone, who was also unusually silent and seemed languid and drowsy. Once or twice he pressed his temples with his fingertips, as if he had a headache, glancing about him in a bewildered manner. What's up, Mr. Holy? Ain't you feeling quite the thing? It is perishing hot in this nook-shotten forest, like sailing along inside a baker's oven. I do not think it is the heat. I am used to heat. Where I come from, in high Brazil, his voice trailed off absently. He said, as if to himself, Is that where I come from? And then to Dido simply, I keep forgetting who I am. Oh, mercy, thought Dido, supposing he's sunstruck. What'll we do then? He's the only one with any sense in this lot. You'd better put a wet cloth on your noodle and lay down for a bit, Mr. Holy, she suggested anxiously. But then he smiled and seemed more like himself, and even taught her a couple of unfamiliar varieties of cat's cradle, and she taught him one invented by herself and christened the Battersea Basket. During that day, the pace of the riverboat gradually slowed down as the momentum of the board decreased, and the rowers had to work harder at their levers. Now flies and mosquitoes came on board, all kinds of terrible little buzzing, biting creatures. Hummed and clustered and plagued the passengers, stinging and piercing every inch of exposed skin, creeping cunningly under the folds of clothes to jab in unexpected and tender spots. Fortunately, Mr. Holystone's dark green cactus lotion for repelling cockroaches also proved a useful defense against jungle insects, but there was only just enough to go round. Poor Noah Gusset, a big pink-faced, tow-headed boy, was bitten so badly that he could hardly see out of his eyes. Dido, small and wiry, did not suffer so much, but by the day's end she was heartily weary of the river. Once, as the boat passed through a narrow tunnel-like reach, with the distant mountains lost to view behind dank masked trees, a sudden commotion in the bows overhead resulted in a slithering thump and a cry of warning from one of the Cumbrian deckhands. A 30-foot snake had fallen in a tumble of coils down the companionway, with a half-swallowed iguana protruding from its jaws. While one of the crew seized the iguana, 3 others grappled with the snake and tossed it overboard. There was an immediate frothing convulsion of water where it had fallen. It struck out like an arrow for shore, but Dido saw, almost with disbelief, that before swimming more than a few yards, it was picked clean to the bone by the rapacious little river fish. A white snake skeleton sank slowly through the brown water. "Ain't that something?" she said in wonder to Mr. Multiple. "No worry of getting rid of garbage hereabouts." But Mr. Multiple, usually so cheerful, had gone white to the roots of his carrot-colored hair. I can't abide snakes," he gasped. "Excuse me, Miss Dido." And running to the stern of the ship, the poor boy was violently sick over the rail. To draw attention from his sufferings, Mr. Holystone said to Dido, "It is custom among the tribes of these forests, I have heard, that when someone dies, the dead person's body is lowered into the river and left for 3 days. Then the skeleton is drawn up again and placed in a sacred cave set aside for the dead up in the mountains." When they sat down for the noon meal, Dido was disgusted to find that the iguana which had been rescued from the snake's jaws was served up, roasted and sliced. She could not bring herself to try it, but nibbled a little mango and papaya. However, the rest of the crew, even Mr. Multiple, now quite recovered, ate up the iguana and pronounced it first-rate, or at any rate better than fried plantain chips. During the afternoon, they entered a region infested with alligators, or caimans, as the Cumbrians teamed them, ugly brown wrinkled brutes, lying sometimes scores together on sandbanks, or floating with only their snouts and bulging eyes above the water. They made a grunting, bubbling noise, and sometimes bellowed loudly and dolefully. Dido thought they were quite the most unpleasant beasts she had ever seen. Once or twice, as the craft wallowed its way upstream, a heavy barbed arrow whistled through the air and struck, quivering, in the soft gray wood of the deck. One of these landed uncomfortably close to the arm of Noah Gusset, who was trailing a fishing line over the side. "Lucky that missed you," said his comrade, the taciturn Plum, "or you'd have been rolling round like a Catherine wheel in a brace of shakes. The Bavarians that live in the woods tip the barbs with what they call angel juice. A drop of that'd turn you into an angel for sure. If any of us gets back from this trip, it'll be a wonder." grumbled Noah Gusset. At last they left the forest behind. The huge trees, thick creepers, and dangling mosses were replaced first by groves of bamboo and rush, then by wide grassy plains, then by pine-clad foothills. Beyond these, reared against the sunset, like ghost castles, were the true mountains, the children of silence, Ambage and Araby, Ertain and Elmai, Araik, Damask, Damyake, Pounce, Pampoil, Garrus, Galay, Calabe, and Catalonde. And somewhere among them, Dido thought, a girl called Ellen. Their sides were so steep that they looked like the fingers of two great hands held up in the air as if to say, "Stop, there is no way past us." Just as the sun set between the cratered peaks of Ertain and Elmai, the riverboat came to a stop at a tiny town in the jaws of a deep and narrow gorge. This was Bewdley, where they must leave the river and take to the Rack Railway. Nobody was sorry to go ashore. They were to spend the night in Bewdley, which seemed a pleasant little place, very ancient, its narrow timbered houses, thatched with palm leaves or roofed with great slabs of mountain stone. There were wide cobbled quays, quays on either side of the rushing Severn, and thick black pine forest came down the steep valley sides to the very garden walls. Market stalls along the riverside, lit by flaring torches, displayed reed mats, fruit, earthenware pots, and straw hats. The air blazed with fireflies and buzzed with the sound of 6-foot bamboo horns, which half the population seemed to be blowing. "They are called bocinas," Mr. Holystone told Dido. "The people blow them at sunset to keep evil spirits away. Otherwise, they believe the spirits might climb in your ears during the night." "Well, surely they've chased the spirits away by now. They've nigh blasted my ears off my head," said Dido ungratefully. As the party from the Thrush staggered along the quay toward the inn, Dido noticed a very short woman pluck at the arm of Silver Taffy, who was walking by himself. The woman was almost completely shrouded in a black shawl. Her face could not be seen. Taffy started at her touch, then turned and followed her up a side alley. The other travelers went on to the Black Tree Tavern, where they were to pass the night. This was not such a large establishment as the White Hart. It seemed comfortable enough. But Captain Hughes was affronted to discover that there was no private parlor where he could dine by himself. He must eat in his bedroom or with the rest of the crew. "Vexatious," he said to the landlord. "I have not been used to sit down to sup with my own steward." Dido heard this with some indignation. Mr. Holystone, she privately considered, was far more gentlemanly than Captain Hughes, and it would do the latter no harm at all to have his top loftiness reduced. The captain was due to be further vexed. Just before dinner, Silver Taffy came to him in a deferential manner, but with a very determined look in his eyes, requested a week's shore leave. "What, you rascal!" exclaimed the captain. "At your own request, I include you in the shore party, and this is how you repay my kindness. We are under strength as it is. I cannot spare you. A week's furlough, it is out of the question." Respectfully, Silver Taffy reminded the captain that in a gale off Cape Orange he had saved the second lieutenant at risk of his own life, and had been promised leave as a reward. It was Captain Hughes's pride that he never went back on his word. "Oh, very well," he said testily, "but a whole week. That is the outside of enough. You may have 3 days, no more, and you must rejoin the party in Bath Regis." A gleam of satisfaction came into Taffy's eye. "Very good, Captain," he said, and speedily left the inn. "Very good riddance, I call it," Dido muttered to Mr. Holystone. "I dare say that was his auntie, the short old girl he was talking to as we came along." Mr. Holystone, however, had not seen her. He seemed excessively tired this evening, slow in his movements and troubled in his thoughts. After supper, which was a silent and somewhat constrained meal, with nobody in good spirits, Mr. Holystone requested a private word with the captain. God bless my soul, now what? Irritably exclaimed the latter. Private? There is nowhere to be private in this wretched little hostelry. Oh, well, you had best come up to my bedroom, you too, Miss Twite. I dare say whatever Holystone has to say is fit for your ears, and if it ain't, it can't be helped. I am not leaving you to be abducted a second time. Rather put out at being considered such an encumbrance, Dido followed them to the small room under the eaves, which was the best accommodation that could be provided for the captain. Well, Holystone, what is it? Make haste, man. I have my log still to write, and my aeronautical calculations. Sir, said Mr. Holystone desperately, I believe I ought not to accompany you on this expedition. What? The captain stared at him with bulging eyes. Oh, snap me, this is too much. I believe I should return to the ship, sir. My presence with you may be endangering all your lives. Return to the ship and leave me without a steward? What is all this about? I won't have it, said the captain, now thoroughly roused. It's bad enough that one of my most able-bodied men should virtually abscond, and now you wish to slope off too. Well, it's not to be thought of, so you may put that in your pipe and smoke it. Sir, allow me to explain, said Mr. Holystone, who looked miserably ill and shaky, but was endeavoring to maintain his calm. He's sick, Dido thought anxiously. He ought to be in bed. Maybe that's what he's a-going to say. Explain to your blue in the face, snapped Captain Hughes. It won't make a particle of difference. Sir, as you are no doubt well aware, the three kingdoms of New Cumbria, Lyonesse, and High Brazil meet, like three segments of a cake, at one point only, the southernmost tip of Lake Arianrod, or Dosmery, which lies among the high mountains to the west of this region. A geography lesson now, grumbled the captain. I thank you. You need not teach me my hornbook, man. I dare say I am well acquainted with the topography of this locality as you are. I doubt that, sir, civilly replied Mr. Holystone, since I, as a child, was first discovered lying among the rushes at the southern end of Lake Arianrod. Oh, you were you? Well, what is that to the purpose? The whole extent of this lake, flatly pursued Mr. Holystone, is contained in New Cumbria, but High Brazil and Lyonesse each claim 1 yard of shore, where the river Camel, which forms a boundary between the latter countries, flows out to the lake, or did before it was dammed. I was found on the yard of shore pertaining to High Brazil. I was discovered at midnight by one of the king's advisors, a wise man who was making astrological observations and collecting medicinal mosses at the time. This man read my horoscope, since it was plain I was but a few hours old. From that, and from a birthmark which I have on my forearm, he ascertained that I came from of very ancient blood, according to the king of High Brazil, Accordingly, the king of High Brazil, Huyanacapek, took me and had me brought up in the palace with his son, Huskar. I was given the name of Atahalpa. Huh, you were, though, remarked the captain, not best pleased, evidently to discover that his personal steward came of ancient blood and had been brought up with royalty. So why ain't you still there, hey? Mr. Holystone labored on with his tale, speaking more and more slowly. My adopted father, who always treated me with the utmost kindness, had me tutored with his son until I was 14, but then, the level voice faltered for a moment. Then he recovered and went on firmly. But then my loyal foster father judged it best to send me to a university in Europe, so I traveled to Salamanca with my tutor and remained there for many years. Humph, muttered the captain again. Should think all that education fit you to be something more than a steward. Did you never go back to High Brazil? Many times I wished to, said Mr. Holystone simply. I wished to see my kind foster father and my cousins. Cousins? Thought you said you were a foundling. Foster cousins, Mr. Holystone amended. King Mabon, the ruler of Lyonesse, was a cousin of Huyanakapik, and his children, Atagal, Martigel, and Ellen, were my playmates and companions when I was small. But no, I never went back. At the death of Huyanakapik 12 years ago, his son, Huascar Kadamon, ascended the throne. He is no friend to me, never has been. My tutor wrote to warn me that if I tried to return, Kadamon would put me to death. Bloodthirsty lot, these Incas, who do you call 'em? Commented the captain. What about the ones in Lyonesse, King Mabon and his brood? I have heard, at infrequent intervals, from my foster uncle, King Mabon. There is little love lost between him and Kadamon, who is a harsh ruler and a touchy neighbor. At present, a doubtful peace obtains between Lyonesse and High Brazil. Twice, however, Kadamon has broken the peace and seized strips of land on the Lyonesse boundary. But Mabon's relations with New Cumbria are even more delicate, and so he hesitates to retaliate. Aha! Exclaimed Captain Hughes, who in spite of himself was becoming interested. Has Kadamon also committed acts of aggression against New Cumbria? Is that what Queen Whatchamacallit's complaint is about? Think you? Devil take it, man. Why would you not let me have all this information while we were still aboard the Thrush? It is worth twice what that dolt Brandywind had to tell me. My position is so awkward, said Mr. Holystone sadly. King Mabon sent me a message 3 years ago suggesting that I lead a revolt against Kadamon. But who am I, after all? My parentage is unknown. In spite of Mabon's friendship, I told him that I had no right to lead a rising against the ruler of High Brazil. What about the Queen of New Cumbria? Cumbria is a closed country, said Mr. Holystone, shaking his head. It is a secret land. The port of Tenby is its only entrance. Nobody goes in or out. The Queen holds no communication with her neighbors. Citizens of Lyonesse or High Brazil may not cross her frontiers. It has always been so. We got in. That is because the Queen has sent for you. Well, said Captain Hughes, all this is deucedly interesting, though why you were not prepared to divulge it 2 weeks ago, bless me if I can see. But what has it to do with your not wishing to accompany us to Bath? That's what has me in a puzzle. Holystone looked at him hopelessly, as if he had come to the end of his strength. The captain reflected and said, No, I believe I do understand. It is because you might be considered a pretender to the throne of High Brazil. Is that it, eh? You think it might put me in an awkward spot if you were recognized so near the country you came from? Just so, sir. Does you credit, I dare say. Should have thought of it sooner. Suppose you were tempted by the chance to revisit these parts. But then, it ain't all that likely you will be recognized, is it? You haven't been back since you were 14? Maybe he's ashamed, thought Dido. After all, he was a kind of prince then. Only fancy, Mr. Holystone. Well, I always reckoned there were more to him than met the eye, and he wouldn't want his old chums to see him now. He's only a steward. Mr. Holystone looked very unhappy, but made no direct answer to the captain. Pray, give consideration to my request, sir, was all he said. Well, I will think about it and let you know my decision in the morning. Meanwhile, kindly see that child goes to bed, and that a watch is kept over her during the night. Yes, sir. Dido's bedroom was even smaller than the captain's, a tiny slip of a room. On the bed was curled something that Dido, for one nervous moment, took in the dim candlelight for a large spider. She was still unsettled by the events of the river trip, but then, with much relief, she saw that the sleeping creature was a small cat, curled up in a tight ball. Hey, puss, Dido said softly. Come to keep me company, have you? She stroked the cat and found, as on the one at Tenby, a collar with a disc, this time bearing the name Tom Tildrum, and a packet consisting of a small scrap of folded paper. Hello, Mr. Holy, she called in a Hello, Mr. Holy, she called in a whisper, but he had made himself up a pallet outside the door and came directly. Look what's here, Mr. Holy, another of 'em. They both studied the words on the small printed page, which said, chirurgeon, one that cures ailments, not by internal medicines, but by outward applications. It is now generally pronounced, and by many written surgeon. Under this was written in small, desperate, dark brown letters that could they be blood? Help! I am a prisoner in a cave on Araby. I do not have air for many more days. Why is she so skint on air? Demanded Dido. That's one thing nobody bothers to sell, because no one would buy it. There's always plenty. Not in the mountains, said Mr. Holystone hoarsely. He had gone deathly pale. His high forehead gleamed with sweat. He muttered, Up on the slopes of Catalonde. One must carry enough air to breathe. There are flowers, night-blooming lilies. Shepherds always carry them. Oh, Mr. Holy, what can we do for this poor girl? But Mr. Holystone was past replying. He had slid to the floor in deep unconsciousness. And that is the end of chapter 4.